Hello YouTube, thought we'd do another video here. Today's video is going to be part 3 on the solar power GMRS two-way radio repeater. Now you're probably wondering, why would I need that? Well, you might want it for a backup, or this might be your main power because there's no power where you want to put your GMRS two-way radio repeater at. So this video is going to be more about some of the hardware you're going to need, whether you want to use an AC inverter, whether you're going to hook it direct to the battery. We're going to talk about, a fuse block, wire size, and all that good stuff. So let's go ahead, and the first thing we got to figure out is we got to figure out our wire size. If we're going to be wiring this up to the battery, we're going to need to know how big of a wire do I need. So once you get your calculation on how many amps you're going to be drawing, in total, what I mean was with your repeater, your Raspberry Pi, whatever you're going to have at your repeater site, you need the total amps. That was my part 1 video. But in my particular example, I'm going to be using the Retevis RT97S. I'm going to be using the mini PC, my interface board, and maybe a cellular hotspot. I calculate about 7 amps. I said worst case scenario, 8 amps. So my forum will have all these links. So let's go to the wire size here. And what we're going to do, hold on. Let me get this called up. Okay, what we're going to do here is, let me click you on to, okay. When you know your total amperage, you got to find how big a wire do I need? How many gauge wire do I need? Now, if you don't quite understand this, when you go to the hardware store, you can always ask someone, hey, I need this gauge wire. Can you take me to it? So in my case, I said 8 amps in my video. Well, obviously, 16 gauge is plenty for me. That can handle 13 amps. I'm way ahead the 8 amps. I'm okay. So a 16 gauge wire that I'm going to need. Now, if yours is more, let's say yours is a 15 amp. Your total current is going to be 15 amp. Well, you don't want to get the 15 amp wire because that's right on which is this one right here. That's too close to the cutoff. You want to go the next wire ahead. So you would get the 12 gauge wire that can handle 20 amps. Okay? So always make sure the wires are rated a little bit higher than what your total current draw is. If not, if I was to take this 20 amp and I hooked it up to 16 gauge wire, well, we know what's going to happen. I'm going to burn that wire. So the wire is going to get hot, the insulation is going to start to melt, and it could start a fire. So don't do that. So make sure that, like I said, if it's a 15 amp is your total, then you got to get the 20 amp one. Okay? So so keep that in mind as you're building this, how much wire I'm going to need, all that. Now, if you're going to hook your devices direct to the battery, then you're going to need a fuse block assembly. Now, what that is, again, this is all on my forum. This fuse block, let me call this up. What it is as you can, it's waterproof, and it lets you pick the fuses that you're going to need for each device. The big cables here come from the battery, positive, negative. Each accessory has its own red wire, okay? So same with the black. So in my case, if I'm going to use it for the Retevis, I'm going to have Retevis, mini PC, my interface board, and cellular. So that would be 4 wires I'd be using on the red, and then 4 wires on the ground. Now each of the hots go through a fuse, and you pick the fuse and you go by what the unit is rated for. Let's say, for an example, you're going to use the Retevis RT97S repeater. That power supply says 5 amp. You're going to use a 5 amp then in this fuse box if you're going to wire it directly. You're not going to use their plug-in. So that's how you pick what type of fuse. Whatever the device says for the output voltage or output current is the amp size fuse you're going to use. Do not do this. Do not, if it's a 5 amp, don't put a 10 amp fuse in there, because that's asking for trouble. Because the fuse will not blow in time, and that wiring that's rated for 5 amp is only rated for 5 amp, and you put a 10 amp fuse in there, that wiring again could get hot, start to melt, start a fire. So do not do that. Okay? So all these links will be on my forum under the solar panel category. So now, let's say, okay, let's go back to the camera. And what I'm going to do, and you might be able, if you got an old extension cord, and if the gauge wire is appropriate, meaning the diameter of it, like we just talked about, you can recycle an extension cord. It's no different. So you could do that to help with your build. I got a whole bunch of chunks of this, so I'll be using probably this. So keep that in mind too. Now, if you're not going to want to be hooking up direct, let's say you can't. Let's say you have to use an inverter because you just kind of want plug and play. You don't want to deal with the wiring and the fuses and all that. And you want to plug and play. Or your device, you cannot hook direct to the battery because it's more voltage or it's less voltage and you don't want to damage it. So you got to use an inverter. Now, a inverter, what that does, this is an inverter. This converts the battery DC to household AC. You plug it in like you plug in your wall outlet. So let's talk about the AC inverters. First off, you're going to have to calculate what size inverter you're going to need. Now this is not hard. This is really simple. Some devices will tell you on the actual power supply. For instance, if you look at the Retevis repeater, it says right here, 60 watts. Okay? If it did not say that and you have to calculate it, you need the output of the device. In this case, it's 12 volts at 5 amps. So if we go to a website, again, I'll post this on my forum. If we go to the website, let me get this called up here. Wattage Calculator, we can punch in these numbers if it does not say, as long as you know the output of that device, the power supply. So if I punched in 12 volts, we don't care about the resistance in this particular video. But if I punch in 12 volts, 5 amps, 60 watts. That's how we can calculate it. Okay? So let's use another example here. Let's go back. Let's say I'm gonna use my interface board. So in my interface board power supply does not have the wattage on it. So let's look at this. Let's focus this camera. So let's do this together. Maybe not. Well, of course, maybe because it's just going to be that way. But nevertheless, it does say on there 12 volts right there at 1 amp. So we're going to calculate the wattage by using the output voltage, 12 volts, 1 amp. So let's go ahead and go back to the page here. We're going to put in 12 volts, which is already there. We're going to put in 1 amp. 12 watts. So now I know my interface board needs a 12 watts. So we're going to write this down. So as I go through this and I convert them, Retevis, 60 watts. Interface, I just did that. That was 12 watts. I converted the mini PC. That's 36 watts. The cellular hotspot, I do not have one here. I'm going to say 1 amp at 12 volts just for the sake of argument. I don't think it's going to be much more than that, although I could be wrong. But to calculate accordingly, we'll go with 12 watts. So that means it's 120 watts. Now, inverters are sold, AC inverters are sold in wattage, 100 watt, 200 watt, 400 watt, etc., etc. So obviously, in my case, I would not get a 100 watt inverter. That would be enough. I go the next one up at 200 watts. So let's look at my inverter and see if it can handle my load or what I want to hook up. So let's go ahead and go back to the camera here. And we're going to look at my inverter. Now, there's one thing here I want to show you that you should pay attention to. If you look at this inverter, it says 400 watts continuously, 800 watts peak. 800 watts peak means occasional, not continuously. But as you can see, continuous wattage is 400 watts. This will work plenty easily on my setup. I could even go a little bit smaller if I wanted to. But this would work on my setup. You want the continuous wattage readings is what you want to go by. And like I said, 400 watts. So this would work. So now if I was to do this, although a lot of times they do have a built-in, inverters usually have a built-in fuse inside of here, but I would hook this up with another fuse. I take some wire, go through a fuse to the positive terminal, and then to the negative terminal. And now I can get in a small extension cord, and now I can plug in just like a household. I can, like there's only two here, but if you get a small extension cord, you can plug in all what you need, just like you would in a house. Now you may be wondering, if you're not familiar with inverters, there's different types. There is what they call a pure sine wave inverter. That inverter is going to be a little more money. The difference between them is the pure sine wave is going to, how's the best way I can say this, is going to be more closer to the AC outlet voltage if you hooked it up to a scope. So you probably are asking yourself, well, when do I need to get that, or can I just get the cheaper inverter? And the best way to answer this is, let's go ahead and let's go to, here is a website here. I'll post this on my forum also. Do you need a pure sine inverter? Here are some of the questions you need to ask yourself. Are you going to be powering a device that uses a motor, like a refrigerator or a fan? And is it medical equipment? Well, it's not. We're not doing none of that unless you're hooking up your solar panel to your house or something. Then if you look here, oops, I went too far. If you answered yes to either the first two, you may need a pure sine wave inverter. If you answer yes to neither of the second questions, then you will be fine without one. Now, I know some people are going to say, well, wait a minute here. You're going to be hooking up a mini PC. So, geez, maybe you should have a, pure, sine wave inverter and spend the extra money. Well, truth be told, I've used cheap inverters. I've used expensive inverters. Unless it's like this website states, I've used them on computers and worked just fine. I haven't had any problem. I've done it for many times, for many hours, long time. I didn't have an issue. But if you're going to be using if you want to plug in a fan or obviously medical equipment, that's a little different. But you should be fine plugging your Raspberry Pi into a non-pure sine wave inverter. But if you want to play it safe, when you look up your inverter, you just use the words pure sine wave inverter. Or in this case, if I was going to look up my inverter and I was going to buy a pure, I would type in pure sine wave 200 watt inverter. That's how I would look on eBay. That's how I would look on Amazon, and then you'll find, and make sure the ad does clearly state pure sine wave. If it does not state that, then it probably is not a pure sine wave. So be careful about that. But I've done it without it, and I've been fine. But there's certain conditions you may need one. So again, it depends on how picky you want to be. But in my case, let's go back to the camera. Mine is not a pure wave sine inverter, and I've ran many things off this, and it worked just fine. So there you have it. Now, so you can do the inverter and it's less wiring, obviously, because you just plug it in, like you just hook up the inverter and you plug everything else in. Obviously the solar, the controller, let me kind of, maybe I should explain this. The controller for your solar power is going to have terminals for the battery, plus and minus. You'd hook these up accordingly to the battery. This is what's going to be hooked to your battery. This is what's going to charge the battery. Okay? So, you know, and this ain't too big of stuff to have. You know, I got the repeater. I got the mini PC, you know, if I use a cellular hotspot. So, you know, you got to kind of keep in mind, you know, what your layout's going to be. I suggest laying out your items on a bench and kind of figure out how you want them. You don't want them too close because, you know, for heat. But also, too, keep in mind, if you're going to put this in a container and you're going to use cellular hotspot, be careful how you do that, because if you get a metal container and you put your cellular hotspot inside the metal container, you may not get reception. So be careful of that. Keep that in mind when you do this. So I'll probably just use a plastic type of a tote, to be honest with you, like a pretty heavy duty one you get at Walmart. I'll have to see as I build mine, but hopefully you kind of get how to do this now. One thing I do want to mention, now some of these, like if I grab, and let me grab it here. Okay, here we go. Here is the adapter for the Retevis repeater. Notice how I can plug it in. So what I could do, if I don't want to run an inverter and I want to save money and I want to save space, since this adapter does have a built-in fuse, I could get me one of these and wire this up to the battery. Again, wires up to a fuse, and then plug in what I need. So you can do that if your device can handle 12-volt DC direct. I mean, re-emphasize that again. Make sure your device can handle 12-volt DC direct. Do not hook up a Raspberry Pi direct to a 12-volt battery, because you will burn up the Pi. The Pi can only do 5 volts. So that's where you might need an inverter, so you can just plug it in like you normally would at your house. There's ways you can use the battery if you have a voltage regulator, but we'll get into that maybe another video. I don't want to get too carried away here and get people confused. But so I think that should kind of cover some of the hardware. Oh, also too, before I forget, you might want to, your solar panel, I mentioned this in my other video, if you go with the solar panel, you might want to figure out a pole to mount this on, especially if you live in Wisconsin or any place that snows. You don't want this on the ground because the snow will cover it, and you probably don't want the animals and critters getting it too either. So kind of keep that in mind, how you're going to mount that. Like I said, when I start doing the build video, I'll take you with, and you can see how I'm building mine. That might give you some ideas on yours, because sometimes it's easier to see it than it is to me explain it. And maybe I'll do it both ways. Maybe I'll do it with an inverter and without an inverter when I do my builds. We'll have to kind of see. So at any rate, if you have any questions or comments, please post them down below. Please subscribe. Thank you, and have a good day.